All right, one other feature that I use quite frequently is that I like to have some influence on where people look in my photos. Because otherwise, if they're going to look randomly, everybody has a different interest in life than I do. And I want you to look in certain places because I picked up my camera for a reason. There's something in that scene that called my attention, and I'd rather have you attracted to the same thing that attracted my attention instead of what you would naturally look at, if that makes any sense. And part of doing that often is keeping people away from the edges of the picture. I want them in the middle because that's usually somewhere where the interest is. And so there's a feature in Photoshop that I showed you before that is designed to compensate for your lens. Your lens often doesn't deliver as much light to the corners of your picture as it does to the middle, and it'll brighten up those corners. But oftentimes I will purposefully darken the corners just to keep somebody's attention towards the middle of the frame. And I just want to describe something related to that. If you go to the Lens tab, that's where we were at before when we were brightening up the corners. What we did is we just turned on a checkbox that was called Enable Lens Profile Corrections. And when we did, it ended up brightening the corners. I don't know if you can tell in this image, but if you stare at the edges of the picture, you'll see the edges getting brighter. And there was a slider down here at the bottom for vignetting where I could turn it down to lessen it. If I got it down to 0, it wouldn't compensate for it. And if I put it up higher, it would overcompensate. Well, there's also another place, there's actually 2 other places where that can be done. One of them is under this tab called Manual. That's if you used an unusual lens that Photoshop did not recognize, and therefore it didn't know how to correct for the fact that the corners were darker, because it looks up what brand lens you used, which model you used, and then if they've tested that one, it can automatically correct for it with that one little checkbox we used over here. But if it couldn't, you could go to the Manual tab and you find a choice there where you can either darken the edges or brighten the edges of your picture. But the problem with that is if you actually want to darken the edges of your picture to keep somebody's attention towards the middle because it'll be less interesting on the dark edges of your picture, I would not use this slider to do it. Look at the name of this slider. It's called Lens Vignetting. That means it's designed for compensating for a lens. What problem could it be that you'd run into? Well, what if I crop my picture? And in cropping my picture, I decide to only use this portion of it. Well, if I apply lens vignetting, it's always going to be applied to the uncropped image because a lens delivers less light to the corners as it does the middle, and it's always going to be way out there on the edges. It wouldn't make sense once I get out of the crop tool here to lighten or darken this edge if what I'm trying to do is compensate for my lens, because my lens wouldn't have darkened these corners. It would have been the original framing of the picture. Does that make sense? So if I wanted to darken these corners, I would not do it in this area called Lens Corrections. Instead, I would do it under the next tab. It's called Effects. Effects means I want to add an effect to my picture, something that doesn't have anything to do with what my lens caused. And one of the choices there is called, look at the wording, Post-Crop Vignetting. It means after I cropped, let's darken or lighten the corners. Make sense? So now you get an idea for why did they name it that, because sometimes the naming can be kind of, just sound kind of odd. Well, if you didn't know about the other vignetting, then you wouldn't know why this one is better in some cases. If you want to darken the edges for an effect, to keep your attraction more towards the middle of the frame, this is where you want to do it. And it doesn't matter if you cropped your picture or not. You can use this because you have more control. So I'm going to clear my cropping here because I like this framing better. And it's not as special of a photo if you don't have it framed with that arch. So let's look at post-crop vignetting. With that, we have an amount slider. If I bring it up, we're going to brighten. And if I bring it down, we're going to darken. So I'll darken up a little bit here. Then we have a choice called midpoint. And midpoint in general means how far towards the middle of the picture should that darkening effect extend. And so I can make it extend it so it even hits the blue sky at the top, or I can limit it where it's really only on the very extreme edges. But the problem is with this slider is it is sometimes too subtle of an effect to accurately judge how far it's extending. So there's a hidden feature. If you hold down the Option key, it's going to act as if you have the amount slider, which controls how much darkening you're applying, maxed out, so that you're darkening a lot. And therefore, it's going to make it easier to see how far the effect is extending into your image. So if I hold down the Option key right now, Alt and Windows, when I click on midpoint, see how it's darkening a lot? So now I can judge how far should it extend in towards the middle or not extend towards the middle. And when I let go, it goes back to whatever the amount setting was actually set to. So when you hold down Option, it acts as if the amount is maxed out to -100, which means darken as much as you could, and it makes it much easier to judge how far that effect is extending in. Then we have a choice called roundness, and if you want to see what it does, I suggest you hold down the Option key, because it's going to act like the amount slider's turned all the way up. And it affects the shape we're getting. Is it more like a rounded corner rectangle, which is what I get when it's turned down, or is it more like an oval, like a full oval? And I can control that. If you want to know, feather means how does the fade out work? Is it an abrupt transition from where we're darkening to where we're not? Or is it a softer, more gradual transition? And then the slider at the bottom called highlights. I think that's going to become grayed out if the menu at the top is changed to something other than highlight priority. But it looks artificial if you end up darkening things where really bright sun was coming through, because it just wouldn't make sense that sun. So up here, where I probably got some of the darkening hitting the sky, it's going to look a little artificial there, just because that wouldn't usually end up being too dark. So if I bring up the slider called highlights, it's going to try to get the darkening effect off of the bright stuff. And so I don't know if you can see it up where the sky is when I move this to its extremes. So I might need to bring that way up to prevent this area on the left side from getting too dark and to prevent that area from getting too dark. So if you have any highlights that are near those corners, the highlight slider will allow you to try to minimize how much of that gets darkened. So you got a lot of sliders in there, a lot of control. And the main thing is, with the exception of the amount, which is easy to judge because you're seeing the image get brighter or darker and you just go until you like it, with the other three sliders below that, hold down the Option key when you move them. And it's much easier to judge what they're doing and where they should be moved to. But no, you don't always have to move all the sliders. A lot of the times I just move the amount down and I'm done. It's just on images like this one where if I extended too far in, it would just not look right, that I really need to dial it in by moving all the sliders. Just know that not every image will need all the sliders. There is the pop-up menu at the top. There are three choices there. And Paint Overlay is what you might call a legacy setting, which means that if you used an old version of Camera Raw, like years old, years and years ago, and you got a certain effect, and let's say you made a bunch of prints using that effect, and now you have a new photo and you need the same effect that was available in an old version of Photoshop before they improved it to make this feature better, I still need the look of the old one. Well, the old one used to only have the choice called Paint Overlay. There wasn't a pop-up menu here. And this would allow you to reproduce the way old versions of Camera Raw work. And usually Paint Overlay will look the worst because it's the old technology being used. It's just going to be the equivalent to you painting with black around the edges instead of darkening your picture in a more natural way. Then, in general, the two choices you'll be switching to, because Paint Overlay is not usually needed, it's just a legacy feature so you could reproduce the same look that you could get in old versions, you'd switch between these two. Highlight priority is when you have bright stuff near the edges of the frame that wouldn't look natural if they got darkened. That's when you use this. You use color priority the rest of the time, when you don't need to get the darkening effect off of the highlights. Use color priority and the results will look a little bit better. Where it's darkening, the color will look more natural in those areas. But don't stress about it. If this thing is set to highlight priority on the 42 images you've already used this on, don't stress about it. It probably looks fine. It's just if you want to dial it in to the absolute best, I would only use highlight priority when I see bright stuff near the edges that wouldn't look natural if they got darkened. And the rest of the time I would use color priority. So that is post-crop vignetting. You see why it's called post-crop compared to a vignetting that you'll find somewhere else in Camera Raw, which is under the lens corrections tabs, because that's what it's designed for. It's correcting something that happened due to the design of your lens, where it doesn't deliver as much light to the corners as it does the middle.